In the marble corridors of ancient Rome, behind the polished statues and divine titles, lived a woman whose hunger for power and pleasure turned the empire into a theater of sin. Her name was Valeria Messalina, the empress who transformed Rome's royal palace into a brothel and drowned senators in humiliation. What began as whispered rumors soon became imperial scandals, ending in blood, betrayal, and a death so haunting, even her killers looked away. Tonight, we uncover the shocking true story of Messalina, the woman Rome tried to erase from memory. In the final decades of Rome's golden empire, few names would echo with such dangerous allure as Valeria Messalina. Born into privilege, she was a descendant of the Julian bloodline, kin to emperors, niece to Caligula, and fated to live within the poisoned luxury of Roman politics. Her story did not begin with passion, but with arrangement, the cold transaction of marriage that sealed a young girl's body to an aging ruler's throne. Messalina was barely in her mid-teens when she was married to Tiberius Claudius Caesar, a man more scholar than soldier, more historian than emperor. The union was not born from love but calculation. Claudius, twice her age, needed legitimacy through a noble wife. She needed access to the imperial heart of Rome, and she found it. From the moment she entered the marble halls of the Palatine Palace, Messalina understood that beauty could be sharper than a sword. Contemporaries wrote of her quiet eyes and the deceptive calm that masked ambition. She learned early that Rome was a place where power slept inside desire, and both could be controlled with a whisper. In the evenings, while senators debated the empire's wars, Messalina moved among them like a shadow, soft-spoken, observant, and already dangerous. Her marriage to Claudius was a performance of virtue, but behind the painted walls, the relationship was hollow. Claudius, absorbed in his studies and the administration of law, mistook her silence for loyalty. He could not see that beneath her gentleness grew a hunger for influence that no crown could satisfy. She began to realize that the empire itself was her playground, and men were merely tools to reach it. Whispers began to circulate in Rome's corridors, that the empress found comfort not in her husband's chamber, but among his courtiers. The accounts of Juvenal and Tacitus later hinted that her youth and beauty gave her an almost magnetic control. She used her allure not only for pleasure, but for politics, drawing soldiers, servants, and senators into her confidence. To them, she promised affection. In return, she demanded silence and loyalty. Her seductions were not driven by lust alone, but by curiosity, an experiment in control. She discovered that the boundaries of propriety meant nothing within the empire's most decadent heart. In the night, Rome's finest men knelt before her, not as worshippers of beauty, but as slaves to ambition. Each encounter became a quiet transaction, a favor for a secret, a night for a name whispered in her ear. Claudius remained unaware. His blindness was both her shield and her weapon. The emperor, known for his stammer and scholarly isolation, took comfort in believing he had found a devoted young wife. Messalina played her part flawlessly, the dutiful mother, the pious woman attending sacrifices, the loving consort beside the imperial throne. Yet even during these public rituals, her eyes wandered, assessing which man's weakness could next serve her cause. Rome, at that time, was a city that adored scandal and yet pretended to despise it. Behind closed doors, Messalina's beauty became legend. Her admirers claimed she could turn modesty into temptation with a single glance. Her enemies whispered that she was a goddess of corruption disguised as an empress. Both were true. By the time Claudius fully trusted her, Messalina already commanded her own invisible army, lovers bound by desire, officials bought by favors, and guards swayed by promises. She had learned the empire's darkest secret. Power did not belong to those who ruled it, but to those who could control its passions. Rome had gained an empress, but the empire had unknowingly crowned its most dangerous courtesan. The girl who entered the palace as a bride had become something far greater and far more feared. The first cracks in Rome's moral foundation had begun to form, and Messalina's name would soon be the reason why. Power in Rome rarely came from the sword alone, it came from the art of persuasion, from knowing how to bend desire into obedience. Valeria Messalina understood this better than anyone. Once she realized the empire's veins pulsed not with virtue but temptation, she began to weave her invisible web through the city's most powerful men. At first, it was quiet and calculated. She sought companionship among senators, knights, and tribunes, men who admired her charm and saw in her the ideal Roman woman. Intelligent, beautiful, and above all, close to the emperor. Messalina used those illusions like weapons. To one man, she was the sympathetic listener. To another, the lonely wife seeking comfort from a cold husband. Each felt chosen, each believed himself her secret protector. In truth, each strand tied him tighter to her control. Rome's palace life revolved around rumor. Servants traded whispers, soldiers carried glances, and wives repeated what they overheard in the gardens. Messalina thrived in that chaos. She learned that a single suggestion, murmured softly, could destroy a rival or elevate a friend. Through her personal attendants and freedwomen, she collected secrets: who plotted, who betrayed, who could be tempted. The empire's gossip became her private weapon. Contemporary historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius would later claim that Messalina's beauty had an almost hypnotic quality. Men approached her with reverence, fearing both her favor and her rejection. She rewarded loyalty with smiles, promises, and subtle invitations that blurred the line between politics and pleasure. Her palace chamber became less a sanctuary and more a council of ambition. The web spread further. Governors returning from provinces brought her gifts, pearls, silks, perfumes from Egypt, and left owing her favors. Young senators hoping for advancement sought her approval. Not Claudius's. She understood that influence in Rome depended not only on authority, but on intimacy. Behind every decree stood a whisper, and behind every whisper stood Messalina. Her reach extended into the guard as well. She ensured that the Praetorians, those entrusted with protecting the emperor, saw her not as an empress to be obeyed, but as a woman to be adored. She spoke to them kindly, remembered their families, and rewarded them in quiet, personal ways. Loyalty earned through affection was stronger than loyalty bought by gold. Even those who despised her could not look away. Matrons of noble birth saw in Messalina a reflection of everything they feared. Women who had learned to wield the same liberties men claimed as their right. They whispered that she corrupted Rome's virtue, yet their husbands continued to attend her feasts. At those gatherings, laughter and luxury hid careful observation. Messalina studied who drank too much, who boasted too loudly, who could be undone by desire. Every evening was a test, every guest a pawn. Claudius, occupied with imperial duties and unaware of the games within his own walls, saw only a devoted wife who charmed his allies. To him, her sociability was a virtue. To Rome, it became legend. The emperor signed decrees while his young empress rewrote the empire's social order in silk and perfume. By the time the Senate began to suspect her influence, it was too late. Messalina's web had tightened around Rome's most powerful men. They owed her secrets, debts, or shame. Some admired her courage. Others feared her vengeance. None dared expose her. In the heart of the empire, the balance of power had shifted. Claudius ruled by title, but Messalina ruled by desire, subtle, unspoken, and unstoppable. Rome, once governed by laws, was now governed by fascination. And for Messalina, fascination was the sweetest form of control. By the time Messalina reached her early 20s, whispers about the Empress of Rome had turned into public fascination. Behind the marble pillars of the Palatine, luxury hid depravity. Behind her gentle smile, a hunger that no ceremony could tame. Historians such as Juvenal and Tacitus later recorded the rumor that she lived a double life, one as the noble wife of Emperor Claudius, and another as a woman who descended into the city's darkest quarters at night. They wrote that under a false name, Messalina would leave the palace disguised in a wig and simple robe. The empress who dined with senators by day was said to walk among the brothels of the Subura by night, mingling with the city's lowest classes. In dim rooms thick with oil lamps and incense, she watched the trade of pleasure unfold as though it were another form of politics. Each encounter, according to those accounts, was not driven by passion but by dominance, the thrill of being the most powerful woman in Rome, unseen and unrestrained. Whether every detail of these stories was true or exaggerated, their symbolism struck deep into Roman society. In a city that prided itself on virtue yet celebrated indulgence, Messalina became a mirror. Her supposed nights among prostitutes and sailors suggested that even Rome's empress could not resist the corruption at its core. The brothel became an image of the empire itself, gilded above, decaying below. To her critics, these tales proved her wickedness. To her defenders, they showed the fear Rome held toward female power expressed through sexuality. They believed that chroniclers like Juvenal shaped her reputation into moral warning rather than fact. But even exaggeration can reveal a truth. Messalina had made desire a political force. In her palace, she surrounded herself with entertainers, poets, and courtiers whose lives revolved around her pleasure. Feasts stretched into dawn, with dancers performing while senators whispered in the shadows. She laughed, drank, and made promises that could raise a man to fortune or destroy him by morning. Claudius, unaware or unwilling to know, busied himself with decrees while his wife turned the palace into a theater of submission. Messalina's boldness shocked Rome's old guard. In their eyes, she represented everything the Republic had once feared, the fusion of lust and authority. Yet for the people of the city, her notoriety became legend. She was the empress who dared to live as commoners lived, who crossed every boundary of status and propriety. Her behavior began to carry consequences beyond scandal. Husbands grew cautious, knowing an invitation from the empress could not be refused without offense. Wives prayed not to draw her attention. Guards, servants, and slaves spoke her name with a mixture of awe and dread. She had turned intimacy into a system of surveillance. Those closest to her were both privileged and trapped. As her influence grew, so did her arrogance. Messalina no longer bothered to hide her dominance within the palace. She openly teased those who pretended moral superiority, knowing they depended on her favor. Every gesture, every glance reminded Rome that beneath its laws and legions, the empire was ruled by human weakness. By night, she returned to her private quarters and gazed over the city's lights from her balcony, a woman worshipped and despised, powerful yet restless. She had conquered men's loyalty, but not her own limits. What began as curiosity had become obsession. The empress who toyed with Rome's desires was now enslaved by her own. The line between indulgence and destruction was thinning, and soon it would break. Rome had always lived by contradiction, a city that preached virtue while worshipping indulgence. Under Messalina, that contradiction reached its breaking point. The empire's nobility still wrapped itself in the toga of morality, yet every senator knew the palace feasts where honor dissolved with the wine. The woman once praised for grace now stood as the symbol of a city's corruption. Messalina's private entertainments had grown more daring. Courtiers recalled gatherings where rank meant nothing and restraint was mocked as weakness. The empress moved among her guests with calculated warmth, choosing who would rise and who would fall by the measure of their obedience to her whims. Those who refused her invitations soon discovered their estates taxed, their allies turned away, or their reputations quietly destroyed. Her allure had become a form of law. Religious leaders watched in despair as temples emptied. Even sacred rites were rumored to bend to her pleasure. Priests competed for notice, hoping imperial favor might shield their failing influence. Rome's moral voice grew quiet, drowned by the laughter from the Palatine. Messalina seemed to feed on the scandal she created. The more the Senate condemned her, the bolder she became. Yet behind her triumph lay anxiety. Every whisper carried danger. Lovers who had once sworn loyalty began to fear exposure. Some sought distance. Others boasted of their closeness to her, hoping it would still their own prosecution. The Empress, sensing betrayal, tightened control. Those who had shared her table were now reminded that silence was survival. Claudius remained blind to the rot within his household. He saw only the harmony of a dutiful wife and a stable court. His advisors, weary of confronting him, allowed the deception to continue. Behind his back, decrees were altered, appointments sold, verdicts reversed, all in the Empress's name. She had turned the machinery of the empire into an extension of her will. The public began to whisper a single word: decadent. To the poor, her excesses symbolized the cruelty of the elite. To the patricians, they threatened the respect that separated ruler from mob. Her beauty, once admired, was now spoken of with fear. Mothers warned daughters that virtue could vanish as swiftly as power. Messalina ignored the murmurs. She believed herself untouchable, protected by the emperor's trust and the silence of her captives. But corruption breeds its own witnesses. Servants traded stories for coins. Guards carried gossip into taverns. Soon every street poet sang verses about the empress who ruled through pleasure and punishment alike. Her influence began to fracture. Old allies sought to preserve their names by turning against her. Senators who had once worshipped her charm now met secretly to discuss limits to imperial authority. They feared that Rome itself might lose its dignity beneath the empress's shadow. In this climate of unease, a subtle change overtook Messalina. She grew restless, more reckless, as if daring Rome to confront her. The woman who once played politics with grace now demanded submission outright. She no longer concealed her favorites or her manipulations. Each new scandal erased the boundaries that had protected her. By the year 48 AD, the empire trembled beneath its own hypocrisy. Rome, wrapped in the silk of pleasure, could no longer pretend to virtue. The empress who had mastered desire found herself surrounded by it, admired, hated, and fatally exposed. The fall had already begun. Only the final blow was missing. The scandals surrounding Messalina no longer shocked the capital. They defined it. Yet even Rome's jaded citizens gasped when whispers began about a new favorite, Gaius Silius, a senator whose beauty and lineage made him the envy of the forum. He was everything Claudius was not: eloquent, athletic, daring. For Messalina, he was not simply a companion, but a mirror reflecting the power she wished to wield openly. Their connection began beneath the formal veneer of politics. Silius, ambitious and confident, flattered the empress with devotion that blended admiration and calculation. He knew her influence could crown or destroy. She, in turn, found in him an escape from the dull obedience of courtiers and the distant affection of her husband. Within weeks, private audiences turned into daily meetings. The palace soon treated their closeness as inevitable. Contemporaries claimed that Messalina and Silius treated discretion as unnecessary. She paraded him through the imperial gardens, appointed his allies to lucrative posts, and presented his petitions directly to Claudius as if they were state matters. Those who served at court understood that the empire's true decisions were now whispered between the lovers' laughter. The partnership was not built on affection alone. Each used the other. Silius gained access to the emperor's inner circle, while Messalina found in him a willing agent for schemes too bold for her own hand. Through him she purchased estates, diverted funds, and punished rivals. The empire's bureaucracy began to serve personal ambition rather than imperial duty. Rome's gossip merchants thrived. Satirists spoke of a shadow government ruled from the empress's chamber, where every promise required devotion, and devotion blurred into surrender. Yet there was strategy behind her indulgence. By binding Silius to her, she secured both muscle and legitimacy, a nobleman who could command troops if needed. Her seduction had evolved into governance. The lovers' audacity grew. When Claudius left Rome to inspect public works, they held feasts that rivaled imperial banquets. Messalina, seated beside Silius as though he were her equal, toasted absent senators and mocked her husband's simplicity. Those present laughed uneasily, aware that a single word of disapproval could cost them everything. Rome's elite now bowed not to the emperor, but to the empress and her chosen partner. Fear and fascination rippled through the city. Some claimed that even the gods turned their faces from Rome. Temples emptied while theaters filled with rumor. The moral guardians of the Senate debated privately whether the empire could survive such disgrace. Yet none dared confront Claudius with the truth. He remained convinced that loyalty surrounded him, unaware that his throne had become the backdrop for ridicule. Messalina mistook their silence for security. With Silius at her side, she felt invincible, as if the empire itself had yielded to her will. Their relationship became performance, a spectacle of wealth, music, and privilege that flaunted defiance before the watching city. Each triumph made her bolder, each indulgence dulled caution. But Rome's patience was finite. Beneath the splendor, enemies gathered evidence. Letters, witnesses, accounts of misuse of treasury funds, all waiting for the right moment to surface. The empire's administrators, loyal to Claudius in name but weary of his humiliation, began to record everything. What had once been rumor was turning into accusation. By the close of that year, the lovers stood atop a glittering edifice built on secrecy and arrogance. Messalina, believing herself adored, could not see the ground crumbling beneath her. Silius, consumed by ambition, forgot that the favor of an empress was as dangerous as her hatred. Together, they had conquered Rome's attention, and together, they would invite its vengeance. The empire watched in silence, sensing that the story of Messalina and her lover would not end in pleasure, but in ruin. In Rome's long catalogue of scandals, none equaled the day the empress secretly became a bride. Messalina's passion for Gaius Silius had grown into something beyond indulgence, an obsession that blurred all sense of danger. What began as private defiance was about to turn into open revolt against her own husband, Emperor Claudius. The plot took shape in whispers. Claudius had gone to Ostia to oversee a minor ceremony. The city was in Messalina's hands. Her confidants, courtiers, and slaves alike murmured that the empress intended to make her bond with Silius sacred before the gods. At first, none believed such madness possible. Divorce an emperor? Replace him while he yet lived? But ambition, once fed, demands spectacle. Silius hesitated. He was no fool. He knew that marrying the emperor's wife was treason punishable by death. Yet Messalina's determination intoxicated him. She promised him the throne itself, claiming that the Praetorian Guard would obey her word and that Claudius, old and weary, could be pushed aside. Historians would later call it lust. Others saw it as a political fever disguised as love. The wedding was arranged under the pretense of a religious festival. In Claudius's absence, Rome erupted into celebration. Messalina appeared not as empress but as bride, robed in white with her hair unbound, symbols of purity mocked by her own past. Silius, adorned in the garments of a groom, stood beside her as musicians played and noblemen, terrified yet obedient, acted as witnesses. The ceremony followed every sacred rite, offerings, oaths, and the final joining of hands before the altar of Juno. It was not a secret act behind closed doors. It was a public insult to imperial dignity. The city's rumor mills exploded. Servants ran to and fro whispering that Rome now had two emperors, one lawful, one chosen by desire. Even the priests were divided between awe and horror. Some said the gods themselves would not tolerate such blasphemy, that lightning would strike the capital before dawn. Messalina's motives remained debated. To some she sought freedom from a husband she despised. To others, it was a calculated gamble to seize ultimate power through her lover. What is certain is that she underestimated the machinery of empire. Her enemies, long humiliated by her cruelty, seized their moment. They dispatched messengers to Ostia to inform Claudius that his wife had wed another man in full daylight. The emperor's reaction was one of disbelief. Claudius, ever indecisive, demanded proof. He thought his advisors mocked him. Only when they produced the marriage documents signed by senators did he pale with terror. His household guards, sensing a coup, armed themselves. Rome's most dangerous woman had crossed the final line. Back in the capital, the new bride reveled in triumph. She and Silius feasted amid garlands and music, believing their union divine. Around them, the air was thick with perfume, laughter, and dread. Each guest forced a smile, knowing that joy might soon turn to accusation. The lovers toasted to the future, unaware that soldiers were already riding through the night to end it. As dawn approached, an omen passed over the celebration, a sudden hush, the flutter of torches as the wind shifted. Those who later remembered that moment swore they felt the empire itself recoil. Messalina, radiant and reckless, had mistaken passion for invincibility. Silius, blinded by ambition, mistook her favor for destiny. When word reached Rome that Claudius was returning with his guards, panic tore through the revelers. Cups shattered, musicians fled, and senators slipped into the shadows. Messalina's wedding of treason was over before sunrise. In that single night, desire had declared war on empire, and the empire was coming to collect its debt. The night Claudius learned of his wife's betrayal changed the course of Rome forever. For years, the emperor had been mocked as weak, indecisive, a scholar better suited to libraries than to thrones. But when word reached him that Messalina had married another man while he still lived, even his timidity shattered. The awakening of Claudius was not sudden fury. It was a slow, dawning horror that hardened into resolve. At first, disbelief held him. Messengers stammered their report. The empress had wed Gaius Silius in a public ceremony, complete with witnesses and offerings to the gods. Claudius stared, his trembling hands unable to grasp the scrolls that confirmed it. His wife, the woman whose name was honored on imperial coins, had crowned another man as her husband. To Rome, that meant the emperor had been symbolically dethroned. It was the freedman Narcissus, Claudius's most loyal advisor, who forced him to act. Narcissus knew hesitation meant death. If Messalina's coup succeeded, she and Silius would seize the Praetorian Guard, control the treasury, and eliminate Claudius quietly. "You are no longer emperor unless you move tonight," Narcissus warned. That simple sentence pierced through Claudius's confusion like a dagger. Messalina's long web of manipulation had always rested on her husband's blindness. She understood how to soothe his doubts through affection, through tears, through the same sensual charm that silenced his suspicions for years. But this time she was not there to whisper comfort. Only the echo of her betrayal remained. Claudius rose from his chair, pale and trembling, ordering his generals to summon the guard. As soldiers marched through the dark toward Rome, the empire's political heart began to pound again. Senators who once groveled before Messalina now hurried to erase her name from their lips. Officials who had profited from her excesses burned documents and hid gifts she had granted them. Rome could sense the shift power was changing hands, and survival meant forgetting her instantly. Meanwhile, Silius, realizing the danger too late, tried to prepare defenses. He dismissed the musicians from the feast and sent urgent messages to loyal officers. But loyalty bought by pleasure fades when death is near. No legion moved. No commander raised a sword. When the first sound of marching reached the city, Silius understood the empire would not fight for him. Messalina panicked. She fled from her new husband's house to the gardens of Lucullus, seeking sanctuary. Witnesses claimed she tore the garlands from her hair and begged her servants for news of Claudius's mood. The woman who had ruled through seduction and cunning now faced the same fear she had inflicted on others: uncertainty. Back at Ostia, Claudius's awakening deepened into grim purpose. He ordered arrests but forbade public violence until he returned to the capital. "Let no drop of blood fall until I command it," he said, his voice steadier than any had heard before. For the first time in his reign, he spoke as emperor, not husband. At dawn, as Claudius rode toward the city surrounded by armed guards, Rome held its breath. The people lined the streets in silence, unsure whether to cheer or hide. The man they once pitied had become something colder, an emperor stripped of illusions. Behind him marched Narcissus, already plotting how to cleanse the court of every trace of Messalina's rule. The empire had awakened alongside its master. The woman who once dominated Rome through desire had unleashed the one force she never feared: her husband's will. The hunt had begun, and no one doubted how it would end. Messalina's empire of pleasure was collapsing beneath the boots of vengeance. The dawn that followed Claudius's return to Rome was heavy with dread. Messalina, once the most powerful woman in the empire, had become its most hunted fugitive. Her name, whispered in palaces, baths, and temples, was now spoken only in fear. The empire she ruled through beauty and deceit had turned against her, and the chase began. Claudius entered the city under guard, silent and pale. Crowds that once knelt in devotion now parted like shadows, avoiding his gaze. Behind him rode Narcissus, the freedman who had orchestrated every detail of this vengeance. It was he who now commanded the Praetorian Guard in the emperor's stead. His orders were simple: find the empress, arrest her lover, and cleanse Rome of her influence. The soldiers moved swiftly. They stormed Silius's house first. The senator, stripped of finery, surrendered without resistance. His courage, so often praised in the Senate, crumbled before the reality of imperial wrath. He was executed on the spot, his body left as proof that betrayal had a price. One by one, Messalina's allies were dragged from their villas: courtiers, secretaries, dancers, even the slaves who had once carried her messages. The empire devoured its own. Messalina herself had fled to the gardens of Lucullus, the same place where she once hosted her infamous feasts. The irony was cruel. Amid marble fountains and perfumed air, she now hid trembling, dressed not as an empress, but as a desperate woman stripped of power. With her was her mother, Domitia Lepida, who pleaded with her to face Claudius and beg forgiveness. But the empress's courage had dissolved. For the first time, she understood the terror of being powerless before the empire's will. The hunt tightened. Messengers arrived reporting her location, and Narcissus wasted no time. "Do not let her reach the emperor," he warned the soldiers. He knew Claudius's weakness. His heart could be swayed by tears, as it always had been. If Messalina appeared before him, she might yet save herself through the same charm that once ruled him. Narcissus was determined to deny her that chance. As the troops surrounded the gardens, Messalina made one final attempt at redemption. She sent a plea through her mother, begging Claudius for mercy, reminding him of their children and the years they shared. But Narcissus intercepted the message, ensuring it would never reach its target. In its place, he told Claudius that Messalina plotted to flee with hidden gold and allies, a lie designed to seal her fate. Within hours, the soldiers entered the gardens. They found Messalina collapsed by a fountain, her face pale, her jewels discarded. The woman who had commanded Rome's most powerful men now knelt before common guards. She tried to speak. Some said she called out Claudius's name, others that she cursed the gods, but the moment passed too quickly. Narcissus, cold and efficient, gave the order. "It is too late for mercy," he said. The soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to strike the emperor's wife. But one drew his sword, and in the silence that followed, the reign of Messalina ended. Her mother turned away, covering her face in grief. The garden that had once echoed with laughter now lay still, its fountains running red beneath the morning sun. When news reached Claudius, he asked for wine and sat in silence. "Messalina is dead," Narcissus told him. The emperor nodded once, as if confirming a fact already known. Then, in a voice hollow with exhaustion, he whispered, "Bring me food." Rome's vengeance was complete, but its soul was emptier than before. The hunt was over. What remained was the ghost of a woman whose beauty had shaken an empire, and whose downfall proved that even empresses could bleed. When morning broke over Rome, the city already knew its empress had fallen. The Senate met in trembling silence, the praetorians waited for orders, and every noble who had once bowed to Messalina prayed that his name was not found on her lists. The empire stood balanced between vengeance and pity, but her fate was already sealed, not by her enemies, but by those who once served her. Claudius remained in the palace, still confused, still clinging to disbelief. The emperor's nature was gentle. He had loved Messalina deeply, despite her betrayals. Even now, he asked again and again, "Is she truly guilty?" His advisors exchanged fearful glances. They knew that if he hesitated, she might return, and with her, the chaos that nearly tore Rome apart. The freedmen Narcissus and Pallas, the real powers behind the throne, understood that mercy could destroy them all. Messalina's survival would mean revenge. Every senator, every soldier who had sided with Claudius in the coup would be branded traitor if she lived to whisper in his ear again. Thus, the decision to end her life was not made by the emperor, but by his household slavesmen who had seen too clearly the danger of his affection. Narcissus took command. "If she reaches him, all is lost," he warned. He ordered the praetorians to proceed without waiting for imperial consent. It was a calculated betrayal, one born not from hatred, but from fear. The same men who once bowed to Messalina's every command now plotted her silence. In the gardens of Lucullus, Messalina waited, unaware of how completely the circle had closed. She believed her beauty could still soften Claudius's heart, that one glance, one tear, would undo all accusation. It had worked before. Why not again? Her mother pleaded for calm, urging her to face truth with dignity, but Messalina's confidence was unbroken. She had seduced generals, senators, and even gods in marble. Surely she could still conquer her husband's pity. As she rehearsed her appeal, footsteps echoed through the garden. The men who arrived were not courtiers but soldiers. Behind them stood Narcissus, expressionless, carrying the emperor's supposed command. Messalina stepped forward, expecting forgiveness. Instead, she met silence. The realization struck slowly that no one intended to escort her back to the palace. She was not being summoned. She was being condemned. "Will he not see me?" she asked. No answer came. Only the rustle of armor and the cold gaze of men who had once obeyed her every whim. Narcissus' voice, calm and final, broke the stillness. "It is over, Augusta. You will not speak with him again." Panic rippled through her composure. She pleaded, promised, wept, but the empire had turned its face away. Narcissus gave her a dagger, offering the illusion of dignity. "Do it yourself," he said. "Better to die by your own hand than by ours." Her fingers trembled around the weapon. For a moment, Rome's most powerful woman stood helpless, caught between pride and terror. The soldiers looked away as she faltered. Historians would later disagree on what followed, whether she struck the blow herself or whether the guard beside her completed it. But the outcome was the same. In the quiet of that garden, the Empress's heart stopped beating, and with it, the last breath of Rome's innocence. Back at the palace, Narcissus entered Claudius's chamber. "It is done," he said. The emperor blinked, confused, then asked for wine. "Messalina is dead," Narcissus repeated. Claudius nodded faintly. "Good," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed sorrow. The empire had been saved, but its saviors were men who had murdered love to preserve order. The gardens of Lucullus had witnessed Rome's splendor for generations, feasts of emperors, triumphal processions, the whispers of power beneath cypress and marble. But on that gray afternoon, they became the stage for an execution disguised as mercy. It was here that Messalina, once Empress of Rome, awaited her end, surrounded by the very beauty she had used to rule. The sun had not yet set, yet shadows gathered thick around the fountains. The scent of roses mingled with the metallic tang of fear. Messalina sat beside the reflecting pool, her gown torn, her jewels scattered in the grass. The soldiers who stood around her shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet her eyes. They had seen her preside over festivals, over trials, over the pleasures of the court, never broken, never begging. Now she was silent, her pride suspended between defiance and despair. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, knelt beside her. "Do not wait for him," she whispered. "Claudius will not come." Messalina shook her head, still believing the emperor's love could reach her. "He cannot condemn me," she murmured. "Not after all I have given him." But Narcissus had already sealed her fate. Claudius would never see her again. The freedman entered quietly, his expression fixed and cold. Behind him, the captain of the guard awaited orders. "The emperor has spoken," Narcissus said. The lie came easily now. Perhaps even he believed it. "Rome cannot rest until you are gone." Messalina's composure cracked. "Gone," she whispered. "I am his wife, his empress. I bore him children." Her voice trembled, caught between fury and disbelief. "You think he will thank you for this?" Narcissus did not reply. His silence was more final than any decree. For a long moment, no one moved. The empress stared at the dagger lying beside her, a thin curved blade, polished to cruel perfection. Narcissus placed it near her hand. "It is better this way," he said softly. "Do it yourself and the empire will remember you with dignity." Messalina's fingers brushed the weapon, then froze. She had faced humiliation, exile, and rumor, but not death. The woman who had once commanded Rome through seduction and cunning now hesitated before a single merciful stroke. Her mother wept quietly. "Do not let them take your life," she urged. "Take it yourself and keep what remains of your honor." Messalina raised the blade, her hands shaking. The soldiers looked away, unable to witness what they had been ordered to allow. But courage failed her. The dagger slipped from her grasp, clattering on the marble. She sobbed once, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire empire. Narcissus sighed and nodded to the guard. A single thrust ended the hesitation that power and pride could not. The woman who had commanded emperors and destroyed rivals died without ceremony, her blood darkening the stones of the garden she once ruled. Silence followed. The breeze stirred the petals floating on the pool, washing them slowly toward the fountain's edge. Domitia collapsed beside her daughter's body, clutching her hand, whispering prayers the gods no longer heard. Narcissus turned away. For all his control, the sight of her stillness chilled him. He had killed her to save Rome, but in that moment, he felt the empire's soul had died too. When word reached Claudius, he asked only one question: "Is she dead?" Upon hearing the answer, he requested his dinner and ate in silence. The court followed his example. By dawn, Messalina's name had been erased from public monuments. Her statues were melted, her portraits destroyed, her memory condemned to oblivion. Yet the gardens of Lucullus never forgot. Travelers would later claim that on quiet nights, the fountains whispered her name, Messalina, the empress who traded her crown for desire, and met death beneath her own roses. Messalina was gone, but Rome could not forget her. Her death brought no peace, only a silence filled with unease. The city that once bowed before her beauty now whispered her name as a curse. Her palaces were sealed, her statues smashed, and her servants vanished as though history itself sought to erase her. Yet even as her image was condemned, her legend began to grow dark, forbidden, and unforgettable. In the months after her death, Emperor Claudius moved through the palace like a man haunted by a shadow he could not banish. He avoided the gardens, refused to speak her name, and forbade mourning. But at night, attendants claimed to hear him muttering to himself, asking questions only she could answer. His new advisors urged him to remarry, to restore stability to the empire, but none could fill the emptiness she had left. For all her treachery, Messalina had been the pulse of his court, the flame that gave life to his reign, and the spark that destroyed it. Historians tried to define her. To some, she was a monster of lust and ambition, the embodiment of Rome's corruption. To others, she was a victim of her own desires, a woman trapped within the machinery of empire, wielding the only power her world allowed her, her beauty and her influence. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal would later paint her as a symbol of female depravity, but beneath their words lingered fascination. Even her enemies could not look away. Her story outlived the emperors who condemned her. In taverns and theaters, poets whispered tales of the Scarlet Empress, a woman who conquered through touch and perished through trust. Some claimed her spirit haunted the very halls where she once ruled, appearing to young brides as a warning of the dangers of vanity and desire. Others said her ghost wandered the Lucullan gardens, searching endlessly for forgiveness that Rome refused to grant. The empire itself bore the scars of her reign. Her downfall marked the end of a decadent era, a brief time when pleasure and politics had intertwined so completely that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. After her death, Claudius's court became colder, more cautious. Freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas gained greater power, shaping imperial policy through manipulation rather than passion. The laughter that once echoed through the palace corridors vanished, replaced by whispers of fear and restraint. Yet even as Rome condemned her memory, the fascination endured. Artists centuries later would paint her surrounded by golden serpents, her eyes half closed in triumph and ruin. Writers would call her the Venus of Vice, the Queen of Scandal, and the woman who destroyed an emperor. Each retelling blurred the line between truth and legend until she ceased to be a person and became a warning, a myth carved from Rome's darkest desires. Time, however, softens even infamy. In the distant glow of history, Messalina's cruelty and indulgence reveal more about her world than about her alone. She lived in an empire where women were possessions, where beauty was a weapon, and where survival demanded cunning sharper than any blade. In that sense, she was not merely the empress of lust, but the reflection of Rome itself, magnificent, ruthless, and fatally corrupt. The gardens where she died were later rebuilt by Nero, who found their silence comforting. But beneath the new marble and fountains, the earth still remembered. The roses grew thicker, their color deeper, as though fed by the blood of the woman buried within their roots. And so, Rome's most condemned empress became its most enduring ghost, forever blooming where empire, desire, and death intertwined.